Welcome to segment 2 of Joe and the Fat Man. Joe Smeltzer, Kyle Fatman Golik with you as always, both writing for Nittany Sports Now, and we're recording this episode on a Monday night, hours after James Franklin's weekly press conference. And really, other than the fact that it's the Oregon game and more people are going to be listening than usual because of that, there really wasn't anything too crazy to come out of it. And that's a good thing for Penn State, considering that if James Franklin says something noteworthy during a weekly press conference, it usually has something to do with injuries, and Penn State really doesn't have any injuries right now, which is always a good thing. Franklin did talk highly about Oregon, as you would expect. Here are the specific players that he mentioned on offense. Dante Moore, quarterback, obviously. Jaden Limer, the running back. Kenyon Sadiq, a tight end, who Franklin actually compared to Tyler Warren, which was pretty noteworthy. Decorian Moore, a true freshman receiver who has already taken the country by storm. Then on Oregon's defense, Franklin talked about Mateo Uigagile, a linebacker, Amari Washington on the defensive line, Cruz rushing at defensive back, Dylan Tyneman also at defensive back, and Bryce Boddicker at inside linebacker. So, yeah, a lot of words about the Ducks, a lot of words about how Penn State needs the environment to be rocking, and Franklin said he's expecting it to be something people haven't seen before in Happy Valley. But Kyle, aside from that, what were your big takeaways from Franklin's latest presser?
For me, Joe, he addressed, Max's question about vanilla. And, James is never going to go too deep into it. No coach really is. You know, I think what people have to realize with playbooks is, you know, I don't know, Joe, have you ever seen a playbook?
I've seen like the fronts of them, but as far as the whole thing, no.
you know, I've seen an NFL playbook and they're almost 500 pages in length. So you have to imagine there's a great amount of detail, even in a college playbook. There's no way they're running everything in there. They know their bread and butter plays that they're going to do. You know, you know, they're always searching for something. They're always working for something. I think James, between two questions said, we don't. There's no such thing as vanilla, but we were also building depth. So when you're doing both of those things, there's a lot of trial and error that happens. I also feel that he was trying to build a lot of chemistry with the passing game with Drew Allard and his new receivers. Maybe instead of lining up, going all physical and having Katron or Nick getting that first down, hey, let's try to see if we can throw it and build some chemistry and see what we need to work on. The only way you're really going to ever do it is in live games. This was Penn State's essentially preseason. They knew like none of the games were ever in danger, so this is where you're going to try some things, and that's what they did. The other major thing with them is just seeing how mature really the safety situation, how fluid it is between Belgrave Shorter and King Mack and Dee Lane. Franklin feels he has three amazing safeties that will complement Zaki Wheatley, and just hearing that competition is still going on with no winner, that and he spoke volumes of King Mack about how he hasn't allowed him not being named the winner drag him down, and he's been really high on King the past few weeks, Joe. Between what he's done in games, between how these Monday press conferences, he's really signaled out him. And King Mack seems to be one of those guys that, he's not only bringing it to the table from a player perspective on what he can do on the field, but there's also these intangibles on how he's carrying himself.
Yeah, and King Mack's a guy. You think about his skill set and what he's able to do. It really is quite impressive. He's only about 5'8", but he's still playing on the second level. He's hitting people and he's hitting them hard. He's a guy that plays well above what his physical build is, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. And there's a lot to be said for what he can do on special teams too, which we saw against Nevada with that long kick return. Yeah, something else Franklin talked about is we're getting to game four. Freshmen are allowed to play in 5 games in the regular season before they burn their red shirt, and there's some Penn State players who are getting pretty close, with obviously Darius Dixon and Chaz Coleman being the guys that Franklin greenlit to basically play whenever needed without the red shirt being a worry. They've each played in their first 3 games, and assuming they do play against Oregon too, they will have played the maximum before burning their red shirt. Yvonne Komaju at defensive end, he's a guy that's also played in 4 games, wasn't given that green light designation, but I think he's a guy that we're pretty sure is going to burn his red shirt too. And then Franklin talked a little bit about some guys that are next in line for burning that red shirt. Jameer Joseph had that big pick six against Villanova. He's played in 2 games, so we'll see if he's able to burn that red shirt. It'll be interesting to see how that develops with how deep Penn State's secondary is. Kobe Howard has played in 2 games. I think some fans were expecting to see a little bit more of him. He played, I think, 22 snaps against Nevada, has only played in 4 snaps since then. So that's a player, Franklin said, a big reason why Howard and Tyser Denmark haven't been used much at receivers, because there's been such an emphasis on Drew Hour, which you alluded to earlier, Kyle, building chemistry with the top 3 receivers and Ross Pena and Hudson. And then a name that really has come alive within the past few weeks, someone that I don't think was getting talked about too much out of camp. Alex Tatch, freshman linebacker from the Pittsburgh area, Greater Latrobe High School. I don't think he's a guy many people thought would burn that red shirt coming out of spring camp. But, Dan Connor, we had him the first day before the Villanova game. He spoke highly of Tatch, actually said that Tatch is the linebacker who reminds him the most of himself. And then the next week, Jim Knowles talks pretty highly about Tatch. He was the first linebacker. He mentioned as a guy who could get a lot of playing time behind the top 3 of Rojas, DeLuca, and Amari Campbell. And then James Franklin, Tatch was one of the freshmen too that he mentioned could be in that discussion to burn their red shirt. Tatch has only played in 1 game, so he'll have a little work to do if he's going to burn that. But yeah, that's a guy that's really come on as of late. And in a linebackers room where you have veterans like Keon Wiley, you have other true freshmen like Cam Smith, who was a big get coming out of high school, flipping from Manny Diaz and Duke. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for someone with that capability at such an early age as a true freshman.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think that we've talked about all these freshmen, and there's no mention of LeVar Arrington II, who probably is most fans. Where is he at in this thing? It's really also showing how promising of a defensive core Penn State's going to have. I mean, there's going to be some major departures after this season, with Denai Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant, DeLuca, Amari Campbell will be gone. Most likely Rojas might forgo his senior year. AJ Harris is probably leaning that way, and Zakee Wheatley. Knowing that you have a lot of these coming up, it only just shows that Penn State's in more of a reload position instead of, we got to rebuild, which is always good. And when you start looking on the offensive side of the ball, Joe, you talked with Troutwine in the offseason. They're trying to have 10 Big Ten starters. Even though when they lose a lot of those senior guys this year, there's a lot of really young, talented guys who could probably start right now. And you look at the running back room beyond Katron and Nick, I'm really liking where Quentin Martin is. Corey Smith is there. Tyke Hayes has gotten a touch in there. You figure Messiah Minkins might get a look next year when he comes in. The wide receivers, we're all talking Kobe Howard and Tyser Denmark, and even Grunkmeyer's even seen some stuff, and Luke Reynolds looks like he's doing. So this is a very promising team, Joe, moving forward. I think James accomplished what he sought in the first 3 weeks of building depth. I think he really knows he's not only just 2 deep in some areas, he might potentially be 3, which is a luxury at this stage, and has Penn State in the position of where they're at.
Yeah, and something too that Franklin mentioned that was of interest to me was when he was asked kind of to reflect on last year's Big Ten championship game against Oregon, which we all know the story. Penn State doesn't have it at the outset defensively, falls behind 28-10, plays pretty well for most of this for the second half and even the latter part of the first half. But really, that 18-point hole was too much to come back from, and Penn State ended up having to settle for an at-large bid, which worked out pretty well. They made it further than Oregon did in the postseason. But yeah, I thought Franklin's answer was interesting when asked to reflect on that. He said they didn't have enough tools in the tool shed, meaning that they were playing man so much and weren't really able to play zone effectively against Oregon. Kyle, as the X's and O's guy, remembering being at that game from the Lucas Oil Stadium press box, would you agree with that? And how do you think Jim Knowles' defense is better equipped to handle the Oregon attack than maybe Tom Allen's was?
So I'll start with the first half, and I remember talking to AJ Harris after that game, and AJ, gave me a lot of good time afterwards talking about you can't really change your schemes because Penn State wasn't really able to match up well with speed. I mean, neither did Oregon for that matter. I mean, both teams combined that game for nearly 1,000 yards of total offense. So that's neither here nor there. But in that game, where I agree with Franklin is that if you would have gone to James Franklin before the game, and he was befuddled after the game, if you run for 292 yards against anybody, for the most part, that's a win. He had to go back there and be like, "We lost this game." That that's perplexing. And I mean, there's other reasons why. I mean, it was a shootout, which is something I think Penn State can ill afford whenever they play on Saturday because they got the weapons to make it a track meet. With Jim Knowles now, in the first game in 2024 on that October evening where it set an Autzen Stadium record for attendance in the state of Oregon, if I remember right, Oregon got 500 yards. Evan Stewart was just untouchable that game. Everything, Dylan Gabriel towards the end of the game, he's not a run first guy, but he was able to have some pretty clutch QB sneaks, including, I think there was one, I think he got either 30-yard touchdown or I know he at least had a 30-yard run on that. But it was one of those games where, Knowles' scheme, Oregon was exploiting a lot of the gaps in that. So when I caught back up with them at the Rose Bowl and covered that, one of the things that I noticed was that everything was airtight and the linebackers were shifting sideline to sideline. The defensive line was very much able, like they weren't needing to dedicate a lot of men onto it. The interior was taking things up where Oregon wasn't able to really run the ball between the tackles. And if they went to the outside, there were the safeties and there were the linebackers that were doing it. And they were getting a lot of coverage sacks because Knowles was pressuring the wide receivers. Tez Johnson wasn't 100% going into that game. Neither was Evan Stewart. Trayshawn Holden was in a rough spot. Kenyon Sadiq might, James talked about him. He hurdled Jalen Kimber in a Big Ten championship game and had 2
Yes, he did.
touchdowns. But it's one of the things I think Knowles figured out was you got to pressure their wide receivers because this isn't a team that you're going to see the quarterback take off. You have to spy the quarterback. You can't just ignore it because, again, guys like Gabriel and Moore are shifty enough to beat you on the run. But if you pressure the wide receivers and make those windows a lot smaller and where it's like, hey, you really gotta get it in there. That's what caused Gabriel a lot of headaches, forced a lot of turnovers, and that's when you saw Ohio State get up. I mean, I don't think you're going to see Penn State get up 34-0 on them again, like it was in the Rose Bowl. But if Knowles' defense does similar things, it could be very much that same lopsided score. And I wouldn't be surprised if that happens because it is really complex. Now Knowles has to figure out how Lanning and Will Stein are going to counter that.
Absolutely. We're going to give our predictions for Penn State, Oregon next on Joe and the Fat Man. The first game we predicted, where we're not 100% sure of the outcome either way.